Now, I'll tell you, this story, and for me it really is a story. I really don't like to consider myself an expert. This is just a story that I have from an organization that I had worked with, and the story started very simply. It started with a question, which is, what metrics will my teams find useful? Now, before I tell you that story, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my own. I learned from an MBA professor of mine years ago that in order to understand someone's perspectives, you first must understand the lens through which they see the world. So I'm with LinkedIn right now. I've been with them for 2 years now. My business card says technical program manager, but for the most part, I'm a coach. I call myself on LinkedIn a professional cat herder. I love cats. I've got 2 at home, and a dog and a lizard and a snake, but most of those are my son. So I've been with LinkedIn for 2 years. The story I'm going to tell you today, though, has to do with my time with a small ed tech company in Mountain View, California called Study.com when I was their lead Scrum Master. Now, before I get into that story, I'll tell you I write a blog on the side at spikesandstories.com. Write a lot of my thoughts, and for the most part, a lot of my thoughts actually comes from my time in the Marine Corps. I spent a decade as a intelligence operative and a martial arts instructor for the United States Marine Corps between 95 and 2006. And it wasn't until I ran into a book called Core Business, written by David Friedman, where he had said, where he had interviewed a whole bunch of very influential Marines. And he had distilled those conversations down to the 30 management principles in the Marine Corps. And I've said it often in a lot of the things I write that what civilians call agility, the Marine Corps simply calls leading Marines. We just happen to be doing it for the last 225 years. So I took a lot of the things I learned as a Marine, dulled the blade a little bit, and that's what I do with teams now. And you'll see some of David Friedman's principles up here, and I hope you agree a lot of them very much embody an agile mindset. And there's one that I didn't put up here, and it's one of my favorite stories to tell, is when I was a young lieutenant out in Quantico, Virginia, I would remember sitting at a table, me and several other young lieutenants, and a Marine would come up and grab us by the shoulder, and he'd sit down and he'd start asking us questions. And it was General Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense now. He would sit at a table, and he would ask us questions about our world, and he would be sincerely interested and engaged in what we had to say. And he would answer whatever questions we had as well. And it's, to us, as Agilists, Gemba. He was a great Marine, served over 40-some years, and there was a lot that you could learn. And one of the principles that's not here is the higher you are in the organization, the more you should glorify the lower ranks. And I think it's very true. Now, back to our story. What metrics will our teams find useful? For me, I'll tell you that there's one that's more important than all others, and it comes from the manifesto. Working software is the primary measure of progress. So let me ask all of you, by show of hands, how many of your teams are delivering working code to your target environment at least, let's say, once a month? Put your hands up, once a month. Keep them up if you're doing it once every other week. Keep them up if you're doing it once a week, once a day, multiple times a day. I got Ian, one hand up. Good for you, man. So one person out of all that. Now, it's really good that you're delivering it so often, but I think there's a very important lesson to learn here, and I'm curious, does anybody play the piano? You used to play. How old were you when you learned to play? 12. So tell me if I get this right. The way you learned to play the piano is you would hit a key, and you would hear a sound. And when you heard the right sound, it started to build confidence. And when you heard the wrong sound, you learned a little something, and you tried to do something different next time. So you hit the right one. And over time, you started hitting more right keys than wrong keys, developing confidence and proficiency. Is that mostly oversimplified, but describe the process?
You're right for the people that they work with their ear, like they try to play. I play with reading notes, and that's most of my way. But you are right for the people that they are trying to listen and do it. That's totally.
Okay. I'm going to change up the piano, and you tell me if I get this right. Okay. I'm going to give you a different piano now, and it's called a delayed piano. And the way it works is simple, is you hit a key, and you wait 15 seconds, and then you hear a sound. So you hit a key, and you wait. I even got a little fancy timer in front of me here. And you wait. And don't forget, this is a delayed piano here, so we have to wait 15 seconds. and then you hear a sound. And then you hit another key, and then you wait 15 seconds, and you hear a sound. For those people who are learning to play by ear, wouldn't you agree that it's going to take them a lot longer to learn to play the piano? To me, that's what frequent delivery is. Every single time you deliver is an opportunity to learn. And if you're not delivering frequently, you're robbing yourself of those opportunities to learn. And it's important to note how valuable that is, that learning that is, because, and this is no hit on our customers, but customers usually don't know what they want until you give them what they ask for. And it's true for all of us, all humans. If you were just left with a piece of paper that's blank and you have to describe what you want, you're going to struggle. But if I give you something that's wrong, you're much more inclined to give me feedback that's useful to build you something that's right. And that's why I think this is so important. I'll tell you at Study, we were an ed tech company. For a subscription model, or for a subscription payment, you got access to materials for teachers in the classroom and videos and quizzes, or homeschoolers like my sister use Study for materials for my niece and nephew. College students can take proctored tests via webcam online and earn college credit online. So it's a really cool platform, really cool mission. And I think we had something like 50 engineers across 6 or 7 different teams, and they were delivering to production on average of 8 times a day. So up to, I think it was something like 16 times a day. So they were almost near continuous delivery. They were always working towards getting closer. So I had some other questions that I wanted to chase after now, that I wanted to figure out how to measure. And I wanted to figure out how to answer these. Like everybody always talks about the connection between productivity and happiness, but what's it look like in our data set? Or everybody always says keep teams together as long as possible. But what happens if you change them up? And where does the numbers change, and how long do they change before a team has something that's stable again? And the last one is probably the most important one for me, which was tying the visceral to the rational. And the thought came to me once where I had used the first probably decade of my time as an Agilist to learn from people like Mike Cohn. And for anybody familiar with Mike, he very much has an emotionally driven tact to affecting change. And then I learned from Jeff Sutherland, the co-creator of Scrum. And Jeff has a very different approach. He's like, let me show you some data. Here's some really crappy data of a team not doing well. And here's some data of a team performing really, really well. Why would you want to do the crappy stuff? Just do the good stuff. I mean, I'm showing you data that shows logically that this is what you want to do. And I was curious if there was a way I could sort of tie those together to get both the visceral and get the rational, and find a way to use that to motivate teams to experiment with ideas to make them more performant. Troy McGinnis, around that time I had run into, and if you're not familiar with Troy, I'd very much encourage you to look him up. He's a great guy with a lot of great materials online and a lot of great ideas around data. And if you're familiar with Troy, you're probably going to see that I stole some of his ideas today in some of the ways we use metrics. And the way this sort of started, within Study, we did any number of A/B tests in production on our users. So we had gigabytes of data about all the people visiting our site. And it was, at any time of day, we had anywhere between 5 and 15 tests running where we would put some measure of our customers through a test, and then we would put all the rest through control. And we would compare, and we would make decisions in data to decide if this is a thing we want to roll out across all customers, or if this is a thing that isn't working and maybe we want to tweak or kill it. And we had all this data about all the people inside the company. And I remember having a very heated discussion with one of our executives where I was trying to explore an idea with the team, and he wasn't having any part of it. And I said, look, I'm tired of you telling me no. I want you to tell me it won't work. Go try it and show me the data. That's what I want you to tell me. We do this every day with our customers, but how ironic is it that we know so little about the 60, 80 people that work inside this company? Let's find ways to measure our teams that are meaningful for them, that encourage them to experiment and explore. And so it was through a hackathon that our company had. So once every 6 months, Study would stop working, and we would get together in whatever teams we wanted to get into. And we would work on whatever things we wanted to work on. And after 24 hours, we would showcase this prototype in front of the entire company, who would then vote on the best idea, and they'd win all kinds of cool prizes. I wish I could tell you my idea won. It didn't win, but we still explored it in the company. But it was through the first 24 hours and creating this that you're going to see today from a team of 4. It was me, it was 2 engineers, and it was a data scientist. And I put in front of them a few things that you're going to see around good metrics. For example, things that are trend-based. If you're going to game a data point, it's a little harder to do over time. So if somebody sticks a camera on you, over time you're going to forget about the camera being there. Not only that, but it's better to compare yourself to yourself at different points in time than try to compare yourself to another team. That's not nearly as fun. Compare yourself to yourself, and that way you can figure out ways to improve. We also wanted to look at leading indicators, things that could potentially tell us about our future. And we wanted to look at things within the team's influence because, I mean, why show them the data if they can't do anything about it? Bad metrics is another thing that we had talked about before we started our hackathon project. Convenient to capture metrics. I would imagine that all of us have looked at metrics that were just convenient to capture, maybe not the best, most meaningful ones. Individual-based metrics, we weren't interested in measuring the individual. You remember the question is what metrics will our teams find useful? There was a good question of what metrics will our team members find useful, but that's not the one we were trying to answer. We were looking for team-based metrics. And we wanted to ensure that if you're going to, well, I'll be clear here. People usually don't do what you expect, but they will do what you inspect. So we wanted to make sure that if we used a metric, we wanted to see the gaming lead to something good. I mean, we didn't want them to game, but if we couldn't do away with that, then at least something leading to good. I'll give you a common example. If you lean into velocity, if you lean into speed, and you're measuring in story points, and you tell a team, I want you to get more crap done. You need to get more done. You're not getting nearly enough done. They might very well look like they're getting more done by just doubling and inflating their story points, and yay, you got 60 points instead of 30. Go team. And now management's not leaning into you anymore. That's an example of gaming lead to bad. I'll give you an example, a similar example of how gaming can lead to good. Instead of counting the number of story points completed in a sprint, count the number of stories completed in a sprint. And if you start, and you shouldn't lean into them too heavily, but let's say you do, if you lean into a team, if they're dividing their stories by customer value, you're going to see thinner slices of work. They're going to be getting more done, providing more transparency as they do so. And there's less risk between having this huge story that takes a whole sprint to do. Now they have smaller stories that are done in 1 and 2 days. That's an example of how gaming could potentially lead to good. Now, in a perfect world, we wouldn't lean into our teams, and we wouldn't have to worry about such things. Some of our goals that we talked about before, and if there's anything you take away from this presentation, it's actually 2 things. Number 1, if you're going to focus on a metric, measure how often teams are delivering to production. And number 2, if you're going to use other metrics, there's a thing that I said time and time again that was incredibly important. Data usually doesn't answer questions, but it'll inspire you to ask better ones. The data is not there to make a judgment. The data is there to make you curious about why the data says what it says. We also wanted to create this framework of experimentation like Dave Snowden talks about, safe to fail probes, safe to fail experiments. We were looking to do something with that. And most importantly, we wanted to measure things in multiple dimensions. We didn't want teams myopically focused in one direction. We wanted to measure things that had a natural tension. So if one thing went up, the notion is that another thing would go down. You tripled speed, but at what cost? Were your teams working 12-hour days and now they're unhappy and they're miserable because of those long days? Or maybe you tripled speed and you said, screw quality, we're just going to put crap out in production. And now your quality plummeted. So we wanted to look at things that had a tension in those relationships to know what we were getting and also what we were losing. This is part of the reason that if you want this slide deck afterwards, hit me up. Now, I'm going to zoom into each one of these metrics in just a moment, but there's a few things I want to mention first. This is 80% of this is what we had in 24 hours. So I was actually quite surprised how quickly our engineers could work. But what they were doing is we were doing a few things. We were looking at speed, predictability, quality, engagement, and cycle time. We were coalescing data from multiple sources. We were looking at Jira. We were looking at HipChat, which was our chat program at the time. We were looking at Git, our repository. And we were looking at Namely, which was our HR system. This is a team dashboard. So this is a single team. In fact, in the very top right, you'll see I blocked out the box where the team members' names would be. So this is one team within the organization. And it shows data over the last 12 sprints, the last 24 weeks, so almost a half a year's worth of data. Now, after I get done showing off these metrics here, I'm going to stop to give you all an opportunity to ask some questions. I usually get some really interesting questions on the other side. There's some other things I want to mention too, but I'm trying to save enough time to answer whatever questions you all have as well. But let me dive into each one of these. The first one I'll show you is predictability. There's a few things on this slide that I'll mention. One of them is again, this is the last 12 sprints worth of data. You see a gray band here, and the gray band was our suggestion to teams that we think you want to end up between 90 and 120% as often as you can. Our formula was a pretty simple one. It was sourced entirely from Jira, and we were looking at the number of story points completed at the end of the sprint and divided it by the number of story points the team left sprint planning with. The slide says completed divided by committed, and some of you will remind me that the Scrum Guide says forecasted. You are correct, it does. I have my own opinions on that word, but you can ask me about that after this presentation. This is a real team's data. You'll even see, although it's really small, 101%, a dotted line that goes down the middle, and above it is 101%. What that's saying is that for this team, over the last 12 sprints, they were able to get done just an eke more of what they committed to at sprint planning. Some people have looked at this and told me that can't be real data or that the team was sandbagging. I guarantee you this was actually one of my teams. They were not sandbagging. This was a team that had been together for some great amount of time. The team roughly was together for 2 years with little changes here and there. It was composed of several engineers, a product owner, a Scrum Master, I was their Scrum Master, a designer, and a data scientist. And they all worked together to work hard. Yes, ma'am?
You said several product owners.
One product owner, just one. Several engineers, one product owner. And they all work together, and this is, in fact, true data. So 101%, that would probably mean that for every 100 points that they committed to, they got done 101 points. The next one we'll look at is speed. This one was looking at two sources for the information. It was looking at Jira, and it was looking at Namely. Jira had the velocity data. Namely had the company holidays, and it had vacation days of employees. What we were trying to do was have the ability to compare a sprint in the middle of May, where everybody was there, and it was a 10-day sprint, to a sprint that had Thanksgiving. That was a shorter sprint, and that lots of people were taking vacation. And the way we did that is we took velocity and we divided it by capacity. Capacity was simply a measure of how many team members were on the team, how many vacation days were being used, how long is the sprint. Now, this team in particular, their speed was flat. A lot of our teams, actually, their speed was flat because these were very high-performing teams, and speed was no longer the most important thing. They had found ways to do really well with getting lots of things done. Now they were focused on other dimensions. And I'll tell you as well, one of the things that worries me after we got done with this is you see these last two metrics was using velocity data. I feel in a lot of ways we might have leaned in a little more on the velocity stuff than I think was appropriate and necessary. We'll talk about some learnings on the other side, but that was definitely one of them. The third one we'll look at is quality. Quality was an interesting one. This is actually the second iteration of a metric that we were looking at. And in this case, what we chose to look at was we looked at information from Git, which was our repository. And we looked at the number of unit tests and integration tests written by team per sprint. And I learned that quality, I think, is just really freaking hard to measure. And this metric didn't create some of the conversations I was hoping, save one. There was one interesting one that I remember with a team who would finish a sprint, we would look at the data, and they had 0 tests written. And they would go, well, we really didn't do anything this sprint that really required us to write any more tests. And then 2 sprints would go by, and they'd say, well, there wasn't really anything we needed to do to write any more tests. And over time, when you see it visualized that it's 0 for several sprints, it made them stop and question that, are we taking quality as seriously as we intended to? So this certainly was not a perfect quality metric. And again, it didn't drive some of the conversations I would have liked to create. I'll tell you one that did, which is this next one. We called it engagement. And what we did is in HipChat, once a sprint, we would put a pop-up into our chat program, into the team channel, and we would ask them, would you recommend this team to a friend or colleague? You might recognize that question. It's used from the NPS, the Net Promoter Score. And in this case, it's ENPS, Employee Net Promoter Score. And we would ask our teams to give it a 1 through 10. And then it would use the NPS calculation to plot a number between 100, which means you're incredibly engaged, to negative 100, which means you're absolutely not engaged. And you actually see with this team here, you see this plummet. I remember what was going on. The team was going through some strife. They were going through some issues internally, and they were bothered by some things, and they raised it to leadership. Leadership listened to what they had to say. Some changes were made, and you can see the team was really happy with what leadership chose to do. And teams loved to look at this. We often looked at this kind of data in our retros, and they were always curious what the score was going to be with this engagement. And I was happy to say they never really dug into anybody like, were you the one to give it a 2? How dare you? They never did that, which was good. And the data was mostly anonymous. If you were really good at SQL, you could probably figure it out, but that's a different story. So they were really interested in looking at this number, and it did make for some interesting insights that we didn't have before. The last 2 we'll look at, we were looking at cycle time, and these were additions after we got done with our hackathon. And for those unfamiliar with cycle time, I will give you a very imprecise definition, but one that works good enough for us. Cycle time is the amount of time to finish something once you've started it on a clock. So if you started something today at 8 a.m. and you finish that same thing tomorrow at 8 a.m., your cycle time is 24 hours. Now, that's not a perfect definition of cycle time. There's some nuance that I'm just going to look over for this talk, but that'll be good enough for our definition today. And I feel like Ian's judging me right now. Oh, yeah, that's true. So what we wanted to do was give a simple way to look at cycle time. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
I'll let you finish this. I have a question on the quality metrics.
Okay. I tell you what, I have one more after this, and I'll make sure we get to your question then. This one, you wanted the number to be as low as possible because you want to finish something as quickly as you can once you start it. And we also wanted to make it simple. Now, I mean, you could have had cycle time measured in any number of ways. We chose to look at it again as a trend over time. This was a newer metric, so we didn't actually have 24 weeks of data yet. You see there are fewer points up there. But we were normalizing for story points. So we were looking at cycle time per story point, per sprint, per team. Now, I'll tell you one time this metric came especially useful for one team. There was a team who wanted to explore WIP limits, work in progress limits. And with WIP limits, what you do is you say, as a team, we're going to open up no more than, let's say, 5 things at a time, whatever that number is. We're going to say 5 things at a time. And this team wanted to explore them, and the reason they wanted to explore them is because other teams had tried them, found success with them, and they wanted to see if they would work for them, but they were incredibly skeptical that WIP limits were going to work. But they said, we'll try it for 3 sprints, and we'll see what happens. So they used WIP limits for a sprint. They got done with 1 sprint, and they said, oh my God, these things are freaking terrible. I hate WIP limits. I'm so much slower. I'm not getting nearly as much stuff done. But I said I would do it for 3 sprints, so we'll try it for 2 more. They tried it for the second sprint. They still hated WIP limits. They still felt like they weren't getting nearly as much done. But what they saw was their cycle time was going down, and their speed was going up. And they were like, all right, I'm still not buying it. Maybe this is just an anomaly. Let's try 1 more. We said we'd do 3. They did 3 sprints, and it wasn't this team, so ignore this data. And they did it for the 3rd sprint, and they got done. And they go, all right, maybe they're not so bad. And I keep on seeing cycle time trend down, and I keep on seeing speed trend up. And over a few more sprints, after that 3rd one, the team lived and breathed by those WIP limits. And I guarantee you, if they didn't have data like this in front of them, they would have tossed them out after 1, 2, or 3 sprints, because they hadn't yet come to terms with the idea that productivity and busyness are not the same thing. And I am sure many of your teams struggle with that as well. And this metric, tying the visceral to the rational, was a great way to temper that so that you thought about it in more just about how it felt, but what the data was telling you. This is the last one we'll look at. This again is looking at cycle time. But now we put aside the notion of trends, and instead we wanted to bucket our stories together. So what you see is all the 1-point stories bucketed together, all the 2-point stories bucketed together, the 3-point, 5-point, and 8-point stories, they're all bucketed together. And the question teams were asking themselves is, are we estimating well? So we're not logging hours, thank God, with the work that we're doing. And so we were looking for some way to know how well we were estimating. The gray bands that you see on each one of those story point buckets is how much divergence there is with each one of those estimates. If it's a long, big gray band, that means that there was a lot of divergence. If it's tighter, that means there wasn't as much. I will tell you as well, and a thing that I often tell teams, that although you want this up and to the right, it's not going to be perfect. And the reason is simple. If estimates were supposed to be accurate, they'd be called actuals. Time and again, teams struggle with this idea that it's a freaking estimate. If it was supposed to be accurate, you'd already have done the work, and you can tell me exactly how long it would take. Now, I will tell you something anecdotally that this told me that I already knew. The 8-point stories is the one that you see furthest on your right. Notice that it is not, in fact, 4 times more effort, or 4 times more cycle time, I suppose, to be precise, 4 times more cycle time than a 2-point story. And you would expect it to be because story points are relative. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen product owners struggle with the idea that if you take an 8-point story and you decompose it, you no longer have 8 points. You have more than 8 points. Because every single time you decompose something, you inevitably find more work. And that's a good thing. And I often had to educate product owners on the idea that that's a good thing, because I just found more work before you started doing it, so now you don't have to reset expectations nearly as often about when some of this work might be complete. Finally, I see in data, not only anecdotally what I felt, but I see in data that, in fact, the more you decompose things, the more work you find. Now I'll open it up for questions. And ma'am, you had one?
Hi, my name is Smita. Do you go to the college?
Sure.
The question that I have is, the team chose this metric in a hackathon.
Yes?
And why did they choose to measure the unit integration test created versus executed test?
I don't think we actually discussed that. In fact, actually, it's not. My answer to you isn't quite right. We didn't decide this one in a hackathon. We actually looked at another one in the hackathon. Later on, when we saw that metric, which the one we were using escapes me at the moment, we chose to explore this one. I don't think we were done finding one that really worked. So this one, while useful, wasn't nearly as useful as I would have liked it to be. So why didn't we? We didn't think of it. There's any number of ways I would have liked to especially improve this one. This, of all the metrics I've shown you today, this is the one I like the least.
Do you think it will be better to measure executed test cases versus created ones?
Perhaps. I think the one I would like to explore next is, I forget the name of the metric, but it's how long it takes you to get a site back up once it's gone down. Thank you. That's the one. That one, among a few others, I've thought about since this experiment that I think would have been better for measuring quality. So there's any number I would have loved to explore. I just didn't get a chance. Yes, sir?
The cycle time graphs.
Yeah.
The time factor on the hours that you calculated, that was based on when the story started and completed?
Yes. So the clock stopped once. The clock started once it was in progress. It stopped once it made it to complete. Yeah.
So not this one, because this is measuring estimates, but prior cycle time. It seems like this is a measure that could lend itself to that gaming for bad behavior, like how fast you want to add all the unit tests on automatic. How would you feel that?
Well, it depends. I would probably need more context to really dig in, but my hope is that there would be another metric that would show that something's being gamed, because you would see something somewhere else. But I actually never saw this metric. No, I take that back. I did see one example of when this metric was gamed, but it wasn't on purpose. It was teams forgetting to open a story and then closing it immediately when they realized they should have closed it. So in that case, cycle time was inaccurate in the system. So all this data was programmatically pulled from its source into its own source and coalesced. So when that happened, we had no way of taking that data out without a lot of manual effort.
Yeah, I worked at a team one time where we weren't measuring this, but I got the sense that prior team had, because he would be looking at a story and investigating, asking questions, and he wouldn't assign himself to the story until he was sort of like ready
Yes.
to work on it.
Yeah.
And so it was just, so you never knew what he was working on at first. You're like, listen, we're not measuring it.
Yeah.
When you're starting to do the thought work on it, go ahead and assign yourself so we know someone else doesn't, and we know where you're.
Well, actually, we'll talk about it soon, but again, it goes back to my idea that data usually doesn't answer questions, it inspires you to ask better ones. So we weren't looking at this data to judge people, although there was a number of people who who didn't quite want to believe that. It took a lot of convincing before they were there. They needed to see it for themselves. Yes, ma'am.
I have a slightly different question, but thank you for explaining super interesting. How are these metrics informed? Is it through a dashboard? Is it something?
I tell you what, I'm going to answer your question real soon, so hold on to that one, and you tell me if I answer it here in a few minutes.
And I'm also curious why who do this yet?
It was by the teams. It was definitely by the teams. In fact, I'll tell you a story. Our founder, his name was Adrian. Great guy, humble guy. But I remember once he was looking at these metrics, and we told our managers, you're welcome to look at them. But if you want to help a team, don't look at it and start helping them. Go ask a team what this means, and don't say this is what you should do for them. Our founder accidentally made a judgment in one of these metrics to one of the product owners, who then leaned into him really hard. And in fact, me and that product owner talked to Adrian afterwards and go, dude, you can't really do that, man. You can't judge these teams. If you start doing that, the data will look exactly like you want it to, and now it's no longer useful. So our managers actually were incredibly good at waiting for teams to ask for their help, or if they were going to engage, they would do it very lightly. Yes, sir.
I see a lot of metrics about output that might be
Ha-ha.
that 70% of features add 0 to negative value. And how do you measure that these actually turn the needle in a positive direction?
You know what? You're actually ahead of me, but I'm going to answer that one now because you give me a really good segue. I mentioned at the start that at Study we were running any number of A/B tests. So we had a good grasp on the outcomes, and we knew what those outcomes looked like. But what we didn't do is have a good grasp of the outputs. Nonetheless, that is me telling you this story right now. Now I'm going to tell you the embarrassing story of where I failed. It took me a year to realize, of looking at this data, that while I was evangelizing outcomes over outputs, that I was freaking measuring outputs the whole time. It reminds me that I still don't get this right on a daily basis. So you are right. Outcomes are definitely what matters more. And I do wish I could tell you that the next talk I'm doing at whatever conference is me telling you how I tied those company outputs or outcomes to these outputs that I'm showing you. I actually tried. I did not succeed. There were more things I wanted to try. Now I'm at LinkedIn, so that experiment has come to an end. But there are a number of things I wanted to try that I didn't get around to, and a number of things that I tried that didn't work. One more question, and then I'll keep going. Yes, sir.
So this question probably is for both you and Ian. So we are working in Agile framework for a long time now, and some of them like have repeated, like building a website was like the .com and some of those metrics you can see that hey, you know what, this is taking longer than what it took me at XYZ company. So based on that, do you think that someone is or know someone who's working to baseline these metrics and have like a standardized work, like say if you're building an e-commerce website, these are the metrics which we need to say, see, and on an average or story point, data should be baseline.
I'm curious. So I'm going to answer this, and we're going to see if Ian agrees with me. I often see at LinkedIn and everywhere else an eagerness to standardize everything. And I don't think it's right. You can't look at humans as if they're cogs in a machine. We are all irrational, and we bring that irrationality to work. Whatever we measure for one team does not guarantee, and if it succeeds, it does not guarantee that measuring that same thing for another team will work. There's a number of, Kevin, there's a number of good practices that you could apply, but best practices does not work in our domain because we are not in that simple space that Kevin would describe.
So let me address so just like how doctors are standardizing things like if your blood pressure is 120 over 80, you're healthy, but if you're 125, there's something wrong with you and put you in that bucket, right? So of course you cannot, I feel healthy, I'm not still. It's
Yeah.
just because I'm out of range. But again, that's
Well, let me give you an example of something that I think could be standardized. I don't think it's this, but I'll tell you something that can be. I borrowed this from Ron Jeffries, where he had talked about imposing agility. I'm a big believer that you should invite people to change, not impose your will on them. But one of the ways that Ron had described imposing agility was simple. He says, every other week, I'm going to sit with you as a team, and I want you to show me what you got done. Not by way of a piece of paper or a spec, but by way of something that works. And then you allow me to bang on it. And every other week, you're going to do that. And if you don't deliver every other week, I want you to explain to me why. I'm not going to tell you how to work. I'm only going to tell you that every other week, you're going to show me something that works. And that's all you have to do. And that's the only thing I'll impose. That's something I think can be standardized, but I think teams should find their own metrics that help them measure the things that are most meaningful and relevant to them. Ian, how much do you agree?
Yeah, I'll just throw
Haha.
there is no such thing in my mind
I would love to answer all of your questions, but there's a few more things. Okay, last one, I promise, and I will answer your questions afterwards as well. Yes, ma'am.
Could I see the quality metrics and just,
You really like that one, don't you? I hate it. I don't know why you like it so much.
I just don't know. So what happened to the release cycles? How often were you releasing when you were having this kind of metrics?
Technically speaking, what they would do is they would look at the diffs in Git to decide how many unit test or integration tests were written. As far as how often things were releasing, it was multiple times a day. We can talk about why afterwards. You were really eager. Okay, fine. One more. This is it. I promise. Last one.
The previous slide where you showed committed versus completed, right? Now, was that for one team?
Yes.
Or
One team.
the one team makes sense, but when you have a bunch of teams that you want to consolidate,
Yes.
it won't.
Well, you can. You can consolidate, but not by comparing, but by adding together and looking. And what you would be looking at would not be the data itself, but is the predictability trending up or trending down? You could look at that.
Yeah, but that is pure though, because unless you standardize your story, which I heard,
Oh, that's a terrible thing to do.
if I heard you right, you do it, you don't, right?
No.
So then you cannot combine those two.
But I think you're ahead of me right now because you'll remember the question I was trying to answer is what metrics will my team find useful? Not what metrics will multiple teams find useful. And each one of them had their own dashboard. Yeah. This is just one sample among many others that we have. All right. So let me give you a few more things to think about. Actually, really good questions from you all. I appreciate it. I hope those who still have their hands up come find me afterwards. I really want to answer your questions. I like how Deming put it. He said, change is not necessary. Survival is not mandatory. You'll remember one of the goals that we had was to find a way to experiment. And I mean, what you really see described here was popcorn flow for anybody familiar with it. What our teams would do would be something pretty simple. They would look at a backlog of different things that they could explore. WIP limits, yesterday's weather, pair programming. Actually, they were already doing pairing, so that wasn't as important. But all these other practices that they could potentially adopt. And the team would sit down and they would discuss whether they wanted to take one of all the ones that they saw here, or maybe they go, you know what, there's nothing here that we like. We're going to make up our own practice and we're going to experiment with that. They would then sit down with one another and they would try to hypothesize how long we want to run this experiment and what we think it's going to change. Whether they want to use one of the metrics that you saw, or we encourage them that if there's something else you want to measure, well, we can't programmatically do it for you, but you can definitely manually collect that data and then use it to drive your experiment. We also told them too, like, this is a framework for the kinds of things that is going to make our leadership uncomfortable. If you just want to tweak something about how you all work together, don't use this. This is too heavyweight for that. We want you to use experiments that you think our leaders are going to tell you no, and this is your way of getting a yes and proving to them that it's a great way to operate. So what would happen after they would hypothesize how this experiment would look? They would sit down with the leadership, and again, the leadership, their job wasn't to say no and be a gatekeeper. They were just there to poke at the experiment a little bit, like, so what's this going to mean, and what kinds of things would tell you should stop this experiment now and it doesn't work early? Or have you considered X or Y and Z? And we would just harden it a little bit because we were new to the idea and we had a fresh set of eyes. Then they would do the experiment. And at the conclusion of it, they would sit down with leadership again and we would talk about what happened. What did you learn? Why did that thing go up? Was it because of something we were measuring? Or maybe there was a confounding variable that we weren't measuring for that affected the data. Why do you think the data looks like it does? And if it was something that they adopted as a team agreement, it would go on a list of experiments that teams had found successful. And if it was an experiment that didn't go so well, it would go on a list of experiments that didn't go so well. And what we saw over time is all the really good ideas would cross-pollinate, that teams would see success from other teams, they would adopt those experiments and they would run them, and then they also would find success. Not always, but often they would find success. And the ones that didn't work, if it didn't work for about 2 teams, most teams didn't want to muck with it then. Now I tell you, one of the biggest struggles, actually it comes back to what we were talking about before. A lot of the teams struggled with this idea that we really wanted them to use the data to drive their own learning, to explore things that maybe they hadn't explored before. But they often had a really hard time believing that we wanted to use this data for all these altruistic reasons. And I remember once, I had asked a data scientist. The data scientist who helped me with this whole thing, through this whole story, is that young lady who's facing the computer. Her name's Ashley. She was a data scientist. What you're actually seeing is the same team for all the data we were just looking at. This was our conversion team. They were responsible for, once a person landed on study.com, your job was to try to get them to give you your credit card number. It's probably not the best way of putting it, but I think you understand. They were trying to get them to convert to be paid users of the platform. And the engineer is the guy that's closest, and on the other side is an engineer, and then the guy looking down is an engineer. And poor Brandon, you can hardly see his head in the frame on the other side. But what happened was I asked Ashley, I said, hey, look, we've got like 1.5 years worth of data now. I would love it if you as a data scientist sifted through this to find some statistical significance in the data. We can't get any kind of significance with the tiny data sets with the experiments we're running. But with this data now, I would love it if you would go look at when teams were changed and looked at the data to see what happened when they were changed up, and then see how long it took before they reached back to where they were before. See what you can find out for me. And she took 2 or 3 days to do so. And before she even showed it off to me, this was her at her desk showing all her everybody on her team, hey, look what I found out. I did not make this conversation. I simply did something as a catalyst to sort of inspire this thing to occur. And it was so great to walk into the office, and I see them all talking to one another. I'm like, I wonder what they're talking about. And I go and I stand behind them, and then I see what they're talking about, and I pulled out my camera and I took a picture. So this is the kinds of things that I love to create, but it was hard. There was a lot of people who were resistant that we were trying to use this data for all the right purposes. I was hoping nobody would ask me that. I don't remember. But at the time, it was really important, and I really liked it. I will tell you this. I remember this much. We did not find a correlation between productivity and happiness, at least in our data set. The changes in team composition, that was a little more nuanced. I don't remember what kinds of things she told me about that. She actually, a few months ago, had sent me the data set again so I could look at it and remind me about it, and I forgot to look at it before today. I should have. There's outcomes over outputs. We talked about that already. I readily admit my failure. I tell you what, one of the things I have learned from my time in the Marine Corps is what they would do is they would put us in experiences where we were going to fail. If we succeeded, we would surprise them. Leadership reaction course is one of those. Any other veterans in the room? What service? My sister was in the Air Force too. She used to get really mad at me because Marines would run by and wake her up. You know, you think after all these years I would have put it aside, huh? Still got those rivalries. I'm so sorry. They had taught us in the Marine Corps how to fail, and I think these brilliant minds that we work with are not especially good at failing. They obfuscate that failure away because it feels unpleasant. And what the Marine Corps taught me is to embrace that, to use the word, because without the word I can't learn. And it's not the failure that's important, it's the learning that comes from it. And I think that's a very important thing to learn, and a lot of people struggle with it, but that was a side note. I'll tell you what, a lot of things we would do different, I borrow very heavily from Dave Snowden. A lot of it goes around the terminology. I keep on using this word experiments, but I think it was the wrong word. I think experiments is a really heavy word. I think probes was a better word, because we were trying to just probe to see what happens. It wasn't like science. It was more just like an adventure. And coherence instead of hypothesis. Again, coherent or a hypothesis sounds very scientific. The way Dave Snowden defines coherence is pretty simple. It is the sufficiency of evidence to proceed. I know enough to be able to do a thing so I can learn a thing. And I think coherence was a better way of putting it. And indicators instead of metrics, again, metrics, really strong word. Indicators is probably a better one. And finally, the last one comes from a team member of mine who called me out on this once. You'll remember we were looking at that speed data, and it was looking at velocity divided by capacity. And when I had created that metric and I was looking at it, I named it exactly as I saw it. I called it points per person day. And team members were always asking me, they go, oh, so is that how many points I get done? I'm like, no. I'm just dividing by the number of members on the team. That's it. Nothing more. I'm not looking at each one of you. But more importantly, one of the team members asked me once, he goes, you always tell me not to compare story points to time. So why'd you call it points per person day? Dude was right. I wish I would have called it amortized velocity instead. I think that would have been a better name for it. I'll leave you with this. One of the things I really didn't touch on that I really wish I would have saved more time for is how all these metrics can go wrong. You can use these to help your teams, but they can also be used as weapons within your organization. You have to be very careful. You have to be curious and not judgmental. What you're seeing is a conversation between two designers and a data scientist. It was a private conversation between those three, and one of them shared it with me after the fact, and it was probably the nicest thing anybody has ever said about me. I hope these are the kinds of things that people are saying about you, and I hope if you bring back these kinds of these kinds of metrics, indicators to your teams, when they start using that data and when you are curious about that data, that these are the kinds of things that they say about those indicators. I think it's really important to recognize that while data can be incredibly important, it can also be incredibly dangerous. So, if you're interested in finding me, this is where you can find me. I try to avoid public speaking as much as possible. I did this on a dare when my manager dared me to go speak in front of people. I'm an introvert, which is why I use apps like LinkedIn to connect with people. But it is a pleasure to talk to all of you. And again, if you have questions and I did not answer them, please come find me afterwards. I would love to talk to you before the conference is over. So thank you so much, everybody. And don't forget your surveys.